Today on Real Estate Backstage, we kick things off by wading into the conversation on the clear cooperation policy. There's been a lot of renewed conversation about this in the last several weeks. This all started about a month ago when AREA, the American Real Estate Association, launched a petition on change.org with the goal of pressuring NAR to repeal the clear cooperation policy. So according to the petition, quote, enacted under the guise of increased transparency, the clear cooperation policy has placed severe restrictions on both homeowners' consumer choice and the ethical obligations of real estate professionals. Under this policy, real estate professionals are forced to submit their listings to the multiple listing service within 1 business day of public marketing, regardless of their clients' wishes, forcing them to disclose information that may not be in the homeowner's best interest. Prior to its enactment, agents could publicly market properties based on the specific needs of their clients without fear of violating NAR rules. Clear cooperation strips away that flexibility, pressuring agents to choose between NAR's policies and their obligation to safeguard client confidentiality and trust, unquote. Now, like I said, this has sparked some kind of renewed conversation within the last several weeks about the clear cooperation policy, whether it has accomplished its intended goal, whether it needs to stay or go, or possibly be amended in some way. Now, AREA, if you're not familiar, the American Real Estate Association, they're a rival trade group that was launched earlier this year as an alternative to the National Association of Realtors in the wake of some harassment accusations that were going on in the upper leadership levels of NAR. And AREA is now flirting with the idea of launching a class action lawsuit against NAR. This would be a plaintiff class made up of both realtors and homeowners who feel they've been harmed by the enforcement of the clear cooperation policy. So according to a recent email that AREA sent to its members, quote, many real estate professionals and homeowners have expressed how this policy has negatively impacted them, from fines to compromised client relationships. If you've been fined or otherwise harmed by the clear cooperation policy, you may be eligible to join in a class action lawsuit against NAR. In response to growing requests from agents, we are currently collecting names of agents and homeowners who have been affected by this policy, unquote. So in case you're not familiar with it, the clear cooperation policy was implemented by NAR in November of 2019, so it's been about 5 years now, and the stated goal was to eliminate pocket listings. I went back to the NAR website and pulled what they said when they first announced the policy about 5 years ago. This is what they said, quote, in recent years, there has been a significant growth in the use of pocket listings and misuse of various limited exposure marketing tactics. These issues have restricted the number of choices for buyers, raised questions about fair and equal opportunity, leading to fair housing concerns, have skewed MLS data, and have resulted in breach of fiduciary duties lawsuits. The clear cooperation policy is intended to address these issues and to ensure home buyers and sellers benefit from having access to the most comprehensive property information through the MLS. It also establishes a uniform rule for all publicly marketed properties, ensuring greatest market exposure for consumers and consistent business practices, which minimizes confusion, unquote. So on one side of this debate, we have the proponents of the clear cooperation policy who feel that it has done a great job of, if not eliminating, greatly reducing the number of pocket listings going on. They argue that without the clear cooperation policy, it would be way too easy for listing agents to do some shady things that may not be in the best interest of their seller and try to force more transactions to be off market in hopes of double ending those transactions and possibly earning more commissions, which of course would be a gross abuse of their fiduciary role as agents for the sellers. On the other side, we have those who believe the rule should be repealed because it creates undue restrictions on the choices of the sellers. They argue that it's really the property owners who should get to decide how, when, and where their properties are marketed for sale. Now, some are saying the clear cooperation policy has been a failure simply because it hasn't actually accomplished what it set out to do. So, for example, in May of 2021, Redfin published a study which seemed to indicate that pocket listings had actually greatly increased since the clear cooperation policy went into effect. And to substantiate this claim, they point to the number of properties that were marked as either pending or sold the same day that those listings were entered into the MLS. So according to Redfin's analysis of listing data from November 2019 through May of 2021, quote, the number of homes sold without being marketed to the public has increased 67%, from 2.4% to 4.0%, unquote. However, I would argue that this can really be explained by just the change in market conditions over that period of time. So for those of you who have been in the market since before COVID, you can think back to what it was like in 2019 before the pandemic, and then the craziness that ensued in 2020 and 2021. At least in my market, the number of properties that went under contract with multiple offers the first or second day on the market just absolutely skyrocketed in the wake of the pandemic. It was not uncommon to see 5, 10, sometimes 15 offers on a property. A lot of our buyers were feeling pressured to submit sight unseen offers because they knew a property listed in the morning was going to be under contract by that afternoon, and they didn't want to miss out. Sometimes we would see offers well in excess of the asking price. We were seeing a lot of appraisal gap addendums, a lot of escalation clauses. Buyers were waiving inspections, waiving due diligence periods. It was just kind of a crazy time to be in the real estate market. So I think that's probably a better explanation as to why a higher percentage of properties submitted to the MLS were marked as pending the first day. All right, so one of the recent developments that I find most interesting is that the Park City Board of Realtors, based in Park City, Utah, has informed the National Association of Realtors that it will no longer be requiring its agents to comply with a clear cooperation policy. According to Jamie Johnson, the CEO of the Park City Board of Realtors, her MLS sent a letter to NAR in early October expressing their intent to stop enforcing the clear cooperation policy. So it's unclear if NAR is going to be taking action against the Park City Board of Realtors for this. They were questioned about it by Inman, and they said, we're currently listening to our members. It's an ongoing conversation. I think if other MLSs across the country start to follow suit and announce that they are not going to be enforcing the clear cooperation policy, then NAR is going to be under a lot of pressure to maybe make amendments to the policy if they don't just repeal it entirely. All right, so Leo Perea, the CEO of EXP, he published an op-ed in Inman last week arguing that the clear cooperation policy is critical to the industry. According to Leo, quote, without CCP, large brokerages would hoard inventory and use it as a recruitment tool, or worse, create a pay-to-play situation where consumers must work with specific agents just to access certain homes. This could lead to market consolidation, where larger firms control the lion's share of the listings, reducing competition and consumer choice. This kind of hoarding would also limit innovation, as small businesses would struggle to compete, and the consumer would ultimately pay the price through fewer options and higher costs. Consumers trust the real estate system because they know that they can see the full market. Without this transparency, buyers and sellers may begin to distrust agents and brokers, wondering if deals are being done behind closed doors and if they're not seeing all available inventory, unquote. So Zillow's president, Susan Damler, also weighed in with an Inman op-ed saying, quote, sellers deserve to have their listings seen by the widest audience. Buyers deserve to have access to all listings. To allow anything else is to move us back in history. It's not fair, it's not equal, and it's not what consumers want, unquote. So my opinion on the clear cooperation policy is that overall it's been a net benefit to the industry and to consumers. So I think in the vast majority of circumstances, it does make sense for the seller to have their property exposed to the full market through the MLS, get the maximum exposure for their listing, which is most likely to result in the desired outcome they want, which is a quick sale at a higher price. This is also a benefit to buyers because they can see all of the inventory. They don't have to wonder about what properties this company has for sale versus what properties that company has for sale that they're not able to easily access online through their preferred methods of searching like Zillow, Realtor.com, Redfin, etc. So, of course, even though this has been, in my opinion, a net benefit and has caused more good than harm, this has come at the expense of a small handful of sellers who have been harmed by the lack of flexibility provided to them by the clear cooperation policy. But that is really how these things always work. Whenever a problem is identified and some type of law or rule is put into place to combat that problem, the pendulum typically swings a little bit too far in the other direction, and there are always some unintended consequences. So again, I think something like the clear cooperation policy is essential because we need to make sure there are guardrails in place that stop agents from doing shady things like not doing what's in their seller's best interest and trying to sell a property off market just so they can earn some more money. But at the same time, I think that sellers should have more flexibility. So I don't know exactly what the perfect answer is. Maybe we have the clear cooperation policy, but we give sellers the option of opting out. And maybe we require sellers to articulate in their own words why they feel selling without the MLS is in their best interest. This could be a win-win because if that seller ever decides to come back and sue, now we have a paper trail and we can say, hey, Mr. Seller, Mrs. Seller, this right here that you typed up, you signed, this is your own words telling me why you felt it was in your best interest for me to list your property without putting it on the MLS. All right, so in other news, the National Association of Realtors has filed a petition with the Supreme Court asking them to reconsider an appeals court decision from earlier this year. So to make a long story short, NAR and the DOJ, the Department of Justice, they had entered into a settlement agreement back in 2020 under the Trump administration. And then in 2021, when the Biden administration came in, the DOJ announced that they were withdrawing from that settlement agreement. So the DOJ had been investigating a handful of practices that NAR was engaging in, such as the clear cooperation policy, which we already talked about at length, and also the participation rule. So the participation rule is what said in order to submit a listing to the MLS, you had to agree to cooperate with other brokerages, but also to offer compensation to buyer's agents. So the DOJ agreed to close its investigation, and in exchange, NAR agreed to boost transparency on commissions and also to update its code of ethics, prohibiting realtors from making claims that their buyer agency services were free. This is why a few years ago we started seeing public-facing websites like Zillow and Redfin publish the amount of compensation being offered to a buyer's agent for each particular listing. So like I mentioned, in 2021, the DOJ announced they were withdrawing from the settlement agreement. NAR fought that, and originally a district court judge ruled in NAR's favor, saying that the DOJ was bound to honor the terms of the settlement agreement that it willingly entered into. But the DOJ appealed that, and then it went to an appeals court, and the appeals court judge ruled in the DOJ's favor, saying that yes, the government could withdraw from the settlement agreement. Now NAR is seeking to escalate that all the way to the Supreme Court. We're not sure yet whether they are going to agree to hear the case, but I hope they do, and I hope they side with NAR. All right, so according to Housing Wire, quote, NAR argues that by allowing the government to retract from the promise it made to close its investigation, the appeals court is setting a poor precedent, and that changing a binding contract based solely on its preference to do so is something that a private party could never successfully invoke. Prior to the appeals court ruling, NAR notes that there have been no instances where the government was allowed to reopen an investigation that it had agreed to close, unquote. And according to NAR's filing, quote, the government enters into contracts in a vast range of contexts in which contracting partners rely on the government to keep its word. Although a new administration is free to change the government's policies, it is not free to repudiate the government's contracts, unquote. I definitely agree with NAR here. I think that if the DOJ is allowed to enter into a settlement agreement and then just reverse course and withdraw from that agreement, I think that's setting a very poor precedent. No private party, no person, no company would be able to do that, and I don't think the government should be able to do it either. All right, let's shift gears and talk about inflation and mortgage rates, which I know is everyone's favorite topic. So data from the September Consumer Price Index, which was released earlier this month, indicates that inflation has continued to cool, but not by as much as economists were predicting. The all-items CPI rose by 2.4% over the 12-month period ending in September, and the core CPI, which excludes food and energy prices, was up 3.3%. According to the Wall Street Journal, quote, the inflation rate has fallen back to where it was right after President Biden took office, but lower inflation readings haven't been greeted warmly by many Americans because the prices of everything from food, groceries, restaurant meals, to housing and insurance remain much higher than they were 4 years ago. The latest reading underscored that dichotomy. Inflation continues to follow a very uneven path down, making it difficult for Federal Reserve officials and economists to feel completely confident that high inflation has been stamped out, unquote. So while the rate of inflation has come down fairly significantly from the peak we saw in 2022, when it was about 8%, inflation is still higher than the Fed's 2% target. And while the inflation rate has come down, prices have not come down. Prices are still going up, and they're still going up faster than they should be. And there's all this cumulative inflation that's baked into the cake. So for example, prices overall are up about 21% on average compared to what they were 4 years ago. Now the Fed, of course, they did announce last month they were cutting their benchmark rate by 50 basis points, and they've signaled that 2 more rate cuts are likely before the end of the year. However, it's worth noting that mortgage rates are not driven primarily by Fed policy. Interestingly enough, mortgage rates actually went up the day of the Fed announcement. And this is because mortgage rates are driven by markets. They're driven by the market for mortgage-backed securities, which is really impacted by investor sentiment, investor expectations about the future. So if investors are not convinced that the Fed has really solved the inflation problem, we could see mortgage rates hold steady or even go up as the Fed brings their rates down. All right, y'all, that'll do it for the show today. I will see you next time for another behind-the-scenes look at the real estate industry on Real Estate Backstage.